Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. Let me start by reiterating what I said on Friday after the court decision came down. We are taking every step to fully implement the voter ID law for the November general election. Implementing the voter photo ID law close to an election will not be easy, but the GAB and Wisconsin clerks are up to the challenge. This is not the first time local election officials have been called upon to step up and serve the voters in a pinch. We ask a lot of our local election officials, many of whom are part-time. We appreciate their efforts. I can't thank them enough for what they've been doing and what we're asking them to do now in the 49 days before the election. Local election officials in our office will be making extraordinary efforts to ensure that all eligible voters are able to participate in the process and have their ballots counted. Here's what we have done and what we will be doing. We are training clerks and election workers. We have an excellent training staff, and we are leveraging the power of the internet with webinars and online training videos. Clerks and election workers were well trained in 2012, but there's been some time since then, there's been some turnover since then. We have developed extensive materials for clerks and the public about voter ID, which will be posted to our website. The most pressing problem now is absentee ballots. The law is clear that most absentee ballots must be accompanied by a copy of the voter's ID. We believe several thousand absentee ballots have already been mailed to voters without notification that they must provide a copy of their ID, but we do not have an exact number. A few hundred absentee ballots have already been voted and returned to clerks. On Friday, we ordered clerks to stop sending out absentee ballots until we could determine what procedures for contacting voters should be and about the need to provide a copy of voter ID. Today we are providing guidance to clerks about how to deal with these absentee ballots, as well as current requests for the ballots that have not been mailed. For those ballots that have already gone out, clerks will have to contact voters and inform them they need to submit a copy of their photo ID before their vote will be counted. The GAB has developed a communication for clerks to use. For current absentee ballot requests that have been received, but the ballots have not gone out, clerks will also have to contact voters and inform them they need to submit a copy of their photo ID before the clerk will mail their ballot. Going forward, all absentee ballot requests will have to include a copy of the voter's photo ID if required. If it is not included, clerks will follow up and inform them they need to submit a copy of their photo ID before the clerk will mail their absentee ballot. Clerks will have to send voter ID instructions along with absentee ballots. The GAB has developed instructions for the clerks to use. Some absentee voters do not need photo IDs. These include military and overseas voters, and in Wisconsin, voters who are indefinitely confined due to illness, age, or infirmity. They do not need to provide a photo ID with their absentee ballot request or with the ballot. These are the challenges that we're facing. Voters need to be reminded of the basics. Most voters already have the ID they need to vote. Driver's license, a state-issued ID card, a passport, a military ID, or a tribal ID are the most common types of ID. A list of those are available on our website. Most people do not need to get a separate ID card to vote. Voters who do need to get a separate ID can get an ID card free at a Wisconsin DMV office, even if they do not have a birth certificate. The address on your ID does not have to match the address on the poll list. Also, your name does not have to match exactly between the type of ID you show and the name that's on the poll list. These are some of the most common questions that we get as we prepare to implement this. We expect that there will be a lot of attention paid to this. We're going to have a very engaged set of local election officials, and the attention that's being paid to the requirement for voter ID should add to the engagement for the voters for the November 4th election. If you have questions, I'll be happy to take them now. What I'd like to do is take questions from people who are here in the room first, and then we'll take questions for people who are listening through the teleconference. So let's start up front.
Radio PM. What about students? We've been hearing some concerns that student IDs are not going to be accepted as a form of identification. What can you say about like university student IDs?
We'll have some additional information, but a lot of the student IDs have not been designed to conform. to the requirements, but we're dealing separately with information out to the, we've been in touch with the university system, and we'll be taking the materials we developed for the last time around, because student IDs require a combination of documents in order for them to be valid. Again, we're 7 weeks out, and so one of the important things to do is to try and encourage voters to, as well as the election officials, to be prepared and take the efforts now during this 49-day period to get the ballots. But yes, student IDs were a challenge before. They'll continue to be a challenge, but they do have an opportunity to participate.
Kevin, what, if any, impact do you anticipate on turnout?
You know, I'm not sure that this has a big impact on turnout. Studies across the country have not really demonstrated that voter ID itself drives down turnout. There's always challenges for people who lack certain types of ID, people who aren't prepared in advance, who wait till the last minute. But that's very typical of the kind of problems that people run into. You know, what drives turnout is what motivates the voters. And quite frankly, we might see that the attention being paid to the need for a photo ID for this election might give us a more energized and engaged electorate. And I'll get to you after I get to the press. Yes.
Just before we came over, the plaintiffs in the lawsuit said they were going to ask for a rehearing before the entire Seventh Circuit. What's your reaction to that? How does that affect what you're doing here?
Well, the only thing that affects us is what the court orders us to do. That's why when, you know, we had anticipated that the court could act this quickly. We had been game planning approaches to this. Obviously, we couldn't be fully prepared. We had other things to focus on. We did have a few recounts after the last election. But we weren't unprepared for this. If the court changes the rules by rescinding the requirement for this, we'll address that as well. As I mentioned before, I think election officials are making extraordinary efforts to ensure we can implement this law. You know, we faced these kind of challenges with the recall elections. There was a lot of uncertainty about how photo ID would be used in the recall elections. We had to address those kind of issues as well.
So what would your advice be to a college student who says, I have an ID? Would you say go to the DMV? Or, you know, we were just at the city clerk's office here, and they were saying Edgewood College has taken steps to make sure their students can use those IDs.
The best advice to a college student is there are several forms of acceptable ID, many of which college students do have access to. A Wisconsin driver's license doesn't have to have their current address on it to be an acceptable form of identification. For them to be registered to vote, they have to provide proper proof of residence showing their current address. But the driver's license, what counts is the name, the fact that it's current since the November 2012 election. So even if it's expired since then, it would count, and that there's a picture that reasonably looks like them.
So it sounds like you're saying don't try to use your ID then.
I'm saying that don't rely entirely on your college ID. We've got 7 weeks to plan this out in advance. Just like you give a lot of thought to who you're going to vote for, give a lot of thought to what's it take to get on the ballot. 7 weeks gives us a lot of time to prepare for these type of eventualities. You can never, if you make a decision at the last minute to run to the polls, there's always a chance you get to the wrong polling place. There's a chance you don't have the required information either to register to vote or the ID. And that's something, you know, we look to our election officials to be prepared. We also ask the voters to be engaged and be prepared.
So we understand, and so students understand what changed, because in 2012, when this was discussed, or 2011, not only UW IDs, but technical college IDs were considered okay. What's changed from then to now? Nothing's
really changed from then to now. It's just a question that a lot of colleges didn't update their IDs. And as I said, there's a combination of forms that they need to show currency because the ID doesn't often have all the requirements in itself. So the student ID was a complex process to begin with. We had to develop special educational materials for that. We did that in 2012. That information's been resurrected. Will be up on the polling place. Plus, we will be making sure that we talk directly with student groups, student organizations to get the message. But you know, one point is to emphasize there are other types of identifications besides a student ID that can be accessed if you plan in advance.
Kevin, under the Seventh Circuit ruling that you just referenced, I believe it actually said that the state may implement voter ID if it wishes and if it believes it's appropriate to do so. With just less than 50 days to go, who made the decision to go ahead with this, and do you believe it's appropriate, given that people can't be retrained, poll workers and so forth? Ballots have gone out. Can you speak to those points?
Well, I can speak to the fact that, before the Seventh Circuit issued its decision, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of effort being put in by the state through the governor's office, through the attorney general's office, through the Department of Health Services, through the DMV, through our office to say, if the stay is lifted, we want to be prepared to go. So, there was no direct order, GAB, you shall do this. It was a question of, we're planning to implement this. Let's take every step to do it. We pointed out a lot of the logistical issues, and frankly, we're looking at how can we best address those logistical issues.
But was there wiggle room in the ruling to say we can't get this done before the 2014 November election and we'll do it for the next one? Did you have that kind of wiggle room, do you think?
I don't think that was a decision that we put a lot of weight in. We figured, the court has made the decision that we're fine. The state's been prepared to go forward. The GAB is a named defendant in these lawsuits. And, there was, as I said, the idea was if this comes off, we need to be prepared to move right away.
The election already started if you sent the absentee votes out already. In my opinion, it already started, so you're discarding those
Okay, well, I'm going
votes.
to thank you for your
I
comment.
think it's illegal.
Sir,
I can say
when I
that.
was speaking with some of the clerks, even before this, their main concern was not necessarily the absentee ballots, but about the training. You have a lot of clerks, many of them volunteers. They're going to be the ones checking IDs. They're not the ones. They don't have backgrounds in bouncing clubs and looking at IDs before. What happens when they look at pictures? Sometimes people haven't taken a picture, with their ID in 3 or 4 years. What kind of training are they going to have to go to, and how do you address those problems?
Well, this is something we've already developed. This is stuff we had in the can. We spent a lot of time in 2011 and 2012 putting together training materials. We broke down the process for poll workers, broke down the process for the voters. There's some very simple items. When the poll workers look at the ballot, look at the ID, they're looking, one, does the picture reasonably resemble the person in front of them? It's not an exact, decision on that, but reasonably resemble. The law also allows, if there's a challenge to that the ballot can be treated as, a provisional ballot. So we have, the real issue is taking the materials that we have. We have a good staff here that's going to be focused on photo ID, getting that information out again to the poll workers, again to the election officials. We did run this in several, ask, but you don't have to show elections in 2011, including the recalls, and we ran it for the 2012 primary, even though that was a very small turnout. So again, we've had some training experience with this. We have the materials for them, and this is the time, quite frankly, where you bring the poll workers in, so we're just going to add to what they're going to get reminded of.
How long are the webinars? Is there any kind of mandatory thing that in order to be a poll worker, you have to take this training?
Poll workers basically have to have at least an hour of training for every day that they would work at the polls. It's not unusual in most elections that they're going to get 1, 2, 3 hours worth of training before a November election. They're less likely to get training maybe before a February primary. But the chief inspector is required to have 6 hours of training every 2 years, and we just build this right into this. I don't have an exact, how long is a webinar.
Is there something new, like a new requirement now because of the implementation of this?
There's not a new requirement now because of the implementation, no. But it's just something that the clerks know they have to refresh their poll workers, make sure that they're aware of the rules. In most cases, it's pretty simple. There's 4 things you have to look at when you look at the ID card: picture, name, currents, and whether the ID is one of the acceptable forms. It's easy to break it down when we do the training. It's easy for the voters to say, when you go to the polling place, this is what you have to do. 3 steps. You got to state your name and your address. You got to show the proper identification, and you got to sign the voter list. So you can break down the basics pretty easily. When people have questions, such as press accounts I was reading, people asking, do they need a separate ID to vote? What we hope to be able to do is to emphasize through press releases and other public outreach to the extent that we can. As I said at the end, here are the basics that you need to know on that. Where clerks will really have to work hard are going to be these extraordinary efforts. DMV and DHS, I know from meetings prior to this, are committing a lot of resources to ensuring that people who do not have an ID, they can work through both with their connections to verify with a Wisconsin birth certificate, but also what they call their petition process or exception process. But they've made a commitment of resources on that end. We'll be directing people who have concerns about getting a state-issued ID to DMV to work through that with those resources.
Can you talk a little bit about absentee ballots? Do you know how many people have actually returned absentee ballots? How do you communicate with them? And also, how do you communicate with people who have received a ballot but haven't returned it?
Well, we're requiring a written communication in all these cases, along with follow-up. We're giving some discretion in the follow-up, but again, this is where we're asking the clerks to take some extraordinary steps. You're going to have to reach out to those voters with a written communication. They got mailed an absentee ballot, so we have an address to send to them. In some cases, we have phone numbers and email addresses for the follow-up, but we want to make sure a written communication is sent to them initially. And again, there are different circumstances for different individuals. The ballots that have already gone out, the ballots that have been returned, and the requests that haven't been sent out. So a slightly different message for each of those groups. And we're giving the clerks some pretty standard language to use on that. And where we're asking them to do more than they normally would be is to do this follow-up. We want to make sure it's not just we sent a letter out, but we do, that we have documented follow-up on this, because we want to make sure that when you have a change this late in the game, where you have a change, and this happens in elections all the time for other reasons. Sometimes the court issues an order putting a candidate's name on the ballot. Sometimes we have really extraordinary events like Superstorm Sandy, where it really tests the ability of the electoral system to respond. This is one where I think we've got the qualified people to do that, meaning our staff, meaning some really dedicated local election officials.
So do you have numbers on those different, how many ballots are in each?
We don't have exact numbers and this is why. The clerks do have, because they're required to track every absentee ballot from the time they get a request to the time that it comes back in. Many of them use our statewide voter registration system to do that. And so we knew that we had on Friday over 11,000 absentee ballot requests at various stages. In some cases, the ballots may not have gone out because, and this gets a little technical, but when we're looking at SVRS, when we generate the mailing label is how we measure that. And so the mailing label may not have been slapped on the envelope and put in the mail, but we were over 11,000 with that. But we have 1,852 municipalities, and I'm not sure the exact number, but it's well under 900 that actually use that system. Many of the other ones are very small, might not have as many absentee ballots. Overall, this election does not generate as many absentee ballots as a presidential election does. In the past, we've seen about 10% of all the ballots being absentee that are cast out of roughly 50% of the voters. So you're looking at a total of 200,000 to 250,000 absentee ballots based on past experience. Again, this election, until you see how the campaign plays out, it's hard to gauge how engaged the voters may be on this. What drives any election is how interesting it is to the voters. And I think voter ID may be one thing that gets them more engaged.
Kevin, logistically, yes. Are you advising those ballots that haven't been sent back yet to include the photo ID in the absentee ballot, or to send those separately to clerk's office? I know some clerks have said there's concern once they start opening on election day, that's really going to slow down the process.
Well, the idea is to send them separately because we want the clerk's never going to open up an absentee ballot. They don't get opened up till the polls come on election day. But because they have an absentee ballot log where they're tracking, and they may use our system to do this, or for some it's easier for them to do it with their own materials because they have less to manage. They can identify, is this a voter who requires ID? We're giving them information to put on the outside of the envelope that goes to the polls. If an ID is required, If they've already received the ID, it won't be necessary. That way, if it says on the outside ID required and the voter put it inside the envelope, when the voters open it up, they'll see. If not, they'll reject it. The ballot's preserved. If there's any kind of post-election contest, such as a recount or a challenge to the outcome, those ballots are preserved, and we'll be able to deal with them. It also gives us a way to measure, how many may have, fallen through the cracks on this.
What instructions are you giving the clerks for those absentee ballots that have already been voted and returned?
For those ballots that have been voted and returned, they reach out to the clerk, to the voter, a written communication with follow-up saying you needed to provide ID as part of the to get your ballot. The law has changed. Please get us a copy of your ID. We want them to get it to the clerk by election day so that the clerk can then stamp whether or not ID is required on the inside of the envelope, because they'll have already taken care of it. The idea, one of the changes in the law from the original one was to say when you ask for the ballot, you have to show the ID if you fall in the category. Again, military, overseas, and indefinitely confined voters don't need to show that in advance.
What happens to those voters who they voted before the court ruling came down? What if they don't follow up and give you a copy of it?
If they don't, the ballot will be rejected. It won't be counted. It won't be destroyed. So if there's any kind of challenge to whether or not it should have been counted or not, that can be addressed through the recount process, through the courts. In other words, we don't lose the ability to do this. If we're in a very close election, and we had a couple elections that were a handful of votes apart, it's possible we could have courts weighing in on whether you count ballots. We saw this after the last election. What you get on election night doesn't always tell you what the outcome is, because there's a post-election certification process on that, and there might be a recount, and we saw election results change. Yes?
What's the deadline for somebody then to submit the photo ID? Is it election day, or is it before then? If they voted absentee. I'm sorry.
We're going to tell people, get it to us, get it to the clerk, get it to your municipal clerk as soon as you possibly can. If it's not there by election day, we're going to treat the ballot as a provisional ballot, and they'll have the same opportunity that other provisional voters do. You got till 4 o'clock on Friday to get it. But, the message is, we're reaching out to you now saying, get us your ID. Don't wait till the last minute. Get it to the municipal clerk.
Will they, will they have until 4 p.m. the Friday after the election to have someone to cast a provisional ballot with?
Yes, that would be what we would. That would be our fallback on this. But obviously, our message is get the photo ID to your municipal clerk as soon as you possibly can. The sooner, the better. Don't want to wait for 7 weeks from today or 7 weeks and 3 days from today.
How would they know, though, if you voted absentee already? How would you know if your ballot's been rejected on election day?
Well, if you haven't turned in your ID, you'll know it's going to be rejected.
You didn't get the letter, you didn't get the follow-up.
Well, this is why we're asking our clerks to make an extraordinary effort. If you got the ballot, you're very likely to get the follow-up from the clerk. This is one place where, this is a very human-driven process. You can always expect that there will be something that falls through the cracks, but it's not going to be for a lack of commitment from election officials in the state of Wisconsin.
Political parties.
Patrick, let me come back this way for a minute.
Do you have a sense of how much this, we talk about extraordinary efforts for clerks, do you have a sense of how much this will cost the local election officials at this point? Just a rough, Madison's talked about almost $100,000.
No, there's a lot of factors that go into what it's going to cost. Obviously, the big factor, and this is a difficult to measure factor we see in every election that turnout can drive, and that is how many people hours do you put in? How much extra time are the clerks spending doing that outreach? How much extra time are they doing, because they'll probably enhance the training, the question that was asked before. They're not going to run through the same checklist they ran through in August or even in 2012. They're going to emphasize the voter ID, so there'll be some extra hours there. The poll workers get paid. That's what's driving, for example, the Madison request is, I want more poll workers. I'm going to need more time to do this. Different places have different ways of overtime. Obviously, our staff will be putting in extra hours on this. It's something that everybody sort of gears up for with elections. You never know what's going to be driving that extra hours. This time around, we have a pretty clear idea what's going to be driving it.
It was, I'm sorry, the the last time this was put in very briefly, you guys had talked about running public service announcements. Is that a consideration this time around?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Public service announcements, radio, TV ads.
You know, we developed a Bring It to the Ballot campaign. We've got the ads in. We don't have it in the budget. We're exploring with Joint Finance how we might be able to. We're also checking, you know, there's a lot of logistical problems to get that out. You know, a lot of the advertising campaigns are done. Reed wanted me to say, we need your help, members of the media, to get this out. I think that goes without saying. I have to say, since Friday, and I hope every day for the next 49 days, you know, we're going to hear some kind of a story about photo ID, the challenges that are being faced, the efforts that are being made. Did you know? We're trying to make sure you have things. You know, most media organizations link to our materials. Those materials, we're re-vetting them again to make sure we want to make sure there's no references to 2012 in there, or even 2010, because that had an impact with some. So we're going through and rechecking all that stuff before we post it. But one of the things we've seen for every election is the media is very good about directing people back to our website on that. We're trying to make sure that attention gets there. It's always difficult. You know, we have 4.4 million eligible voters in this state, and hopefully this, again, focuses people's attention on the election. We could have a very high turnout as a result of that.
Kevin, was there any political pressure put on you by anybody in the governor's office, for example, to have this implemented once the decision came down?
I wouldn't say there was any political pressure. I think there was a lot of discussion. We want to be poised to do this. What does it take to do this? You know, it was approached, you know, the contacts I had were really, we think that the court might do this. This is what we're trying to do to accomplish. So it was a lot of give and take on that. There was no directive that came down saying, you know, Kennedy, GAB, we want to see this happen. It was, how do we make this work? You know, as I said before, we talked about a lot of the challenges for this. It's always a challenge when the rules are changed, and it's not an unusual circumstance for them to be changed. Patrick, I promised I'd come back to you.
Yeah, thanks. The Republican Party has raised concerns about the design of the ballot, sort of separate from this.
Well, let me stop you there. Let's talk about voter ID, because, you know, before we get into that absurdity, I don't want to take away from the voter ID, because the ballot design issue is something I'm happy to address, but I'd really rather get all the questions about voter ID first. Yes?
There are some concerns that, like, rural clerks are not open as long as they're on part-time hours. Is there any effort to open them longer to help voters out there?
We've always known that rural clerks have less hours available, but part of that is they're responsive to the municipality. Clerks tend to ramp up their hours anyway for November elections. Again, this is one of those where, having worked with clerks for 35 years, I know that they're going to be committed to trying to be available. They often have a much better sense of their municipality. We do a lot of follow-up with them on military voters, for example, where we see a military voter hasn't got that. So our office often will be prodding local clerks to be responsive as well. So, you know, I have less of a concern because I have a lot of faith that they're going to be making that commitment. Yes?
Going back to Election Day, is there going to be one person, a supervisor, or kind of who has the final say if they have a question about an ID? You know, is there someone that's supposed to be watching this, or who's going to be the executor?
The chief inspector at every polling place, and they all have them, and they're all required to have additional training, is the person in charge. They'll be making the final decisions on those kind of calls on that. And so, you know, we run into this not just with photo ID, but we run into this with when they're counting ballots, determining voter intent, when they're looking at proof of residence for people who register on Election Day. You know, we have people that we expect at every polling place to be the leader. We call them the chief inspector. A lot of polling places actually call them captains or have other things. But, you know, we look to them to be the person in charge. And the municipal clerk selects that person, so it's someone they have confidence in to do that. So, you know, there is a resolution process that goes on Election Day, and someone does make the final call. In all cases, with absentee ballots, that ballot will be preserved For the voters who do not have the ID, the law provides that they can cast a provisional ballot, which won't be counted unless they come back with the ID. Ideally, now we've got a process in place for those people who didn't plan in advance, that they'll be able to get that ID in that 3+ days after the election. Yes?
You've been around elections a long time. You've got a plan in place on paper, but just based on your experience, what do you anticipate the impact being on the election day experience for voters in terms of lines, questions, concerns? Do you anticipate any glitches?
Well, election day, I say this a lot. Elections are a human-driven process. So people come in, we had an example here of someone who wanted their own message out. And so they will interrupt or be disruptive. And we try to train our poll workers to respond to those things. Clerks are already being proactive. We heard the example, Madison's looking to get more poll workers involved for this election. We had about 35,000 poll workers in November of 2012. We would expect probably that many as well this time around. And you're always dealing with polling place issues because of the human element of this. When I've been at polling places, even without photo ID, people walk in, many of them ready to show that ID. So I would expect, in that sense, it'll be difficult. We've done some timing. Other clerks have done some timing. It does take a little bit longer. We emphasize to the poll workers, they can't just wave something at you. I mentioned the 4 steps. You have to make sure it's the right type of ID. You have to make sure it's current. Does the name conform to the name on the poll list? It doesn't have to be exact. Jim and James, Jack and John, Kathy, Catherine, middle initials. Doesn't have to be an exact match. And the photo has to only reasonably resemble. Since I shaved down a little bit today, I look a little bit better than I did yesterday.
Somebody, and I know I'm guilty of this, a lot of people will not update their driver's licenses when they move. Obviously, you're going to have to, I would assume, if you want to vote in the right precinct or the right
No,
board.
not necessarily. The question was having to update your driver's license. Remember, this is photo ID, so we're looking at the question, is it current? It has to be current as of November of 2012. If it expired after November of 2012, what they're looking at is the name, the fact that it's a Wisconsin driver's license, and the picture reasonably conforms. They're not matching the address for voter ID. They're matching the identity.
So if I were to vote in the right precinct, though, would I have to bring something else that would show I'm at this address?
If you need to register to vote, if you're already registered, your name is on the list. If you need to register to vote, you have to have what we call proof of residence, which could be a driver's license or a state-issued ID card. That has to be current. It can't have expired. It has to have your current address on it and your full name on it.
So as long as you're registered at the address you're currently at.
The fact that your driver's license might be expired, assuming it's not been more than 2 years, is going to be good. And those are the little nuances that, we'll expect those kind of questions to come out. I'm sure you'll be asking more detailed questions of your clerks or locals. And we have materials to back that up. It'll be on our website. It's in the clerk training materials. We don't have to reinvent the wheel on that. That's one of the advantages. It took a long time for us. This bill was signed into law, I think, May 25th of 2011. And we had to put a lot of time into designing informational materials, a lot of back and forth with the clerks, going out and doing voter outreach. So we can repackage that. That's one of the benefits, is there wasn't any real significant change. Obviously, people may, without an ID, have to spend more time at DMV. DMV is putting in the resources to make sure that they can address that.
Kevin, in those kind of disputes, who makes the final call on election?
Which kind of dispute are we talking about here?
Say there's a dispute, somebody says you can't vote because your address doesn't match, or you lost 30 pounds and your picture's different, or whatever.
Are you setting a challenge for me to lose 30 pounds, I hope?
Well, we can do it together. I might sit down there.
Okay. Again, the chief inspector is going to make that. The address isn't going to be an issue. Our training should solve that, so they're not arguing about addresses, because the address on the ID is not what counts. It's the picture, the name, the type of ID, and whether it meets the currency requirements, which in the case of a driver's license, it could be 2 years. And that really is recognizing that people sometimes are in a transition period. They give up their driver's license for various reasons, but they keep it. My mother had her driver's license for years after she stopped driving. But I was well aware if photo ID had kicked in during the time that she was voting, what I would have had to do to help her out.
Just so I'm clear, on the question of the address, if you're not registered and you plan on registering at the poll that day, then you can't use that ID, correct? As the way to register at the poll.
Not to register at the polls. What's required to register on Election Day is an acceptable form of proof of residence, which does include a driver's license. It has to be current, meaning it hasn't expired. And in case of things like utility bills, it has to be current within 60 days of the election. It can't be something from a year ago.
So is it conceivable that somebody could use, I don't know why anybody would do this, but they could use their driver's license with their old address on it, go to that precinct and register and vote?
If it depends on...
I mean, you've got, nobody there is going to say that's not where you live now.
You need double vote?
You
vote in the wrong place?
Vote in the wrong
It's
place.
possible that someone could be in the wrong place
And they could
if
probably
they focus on that. And sometimes those are very fact-specific cases because people may not have established the residence. Bear in mind, you have to be at your location 28 days before the election. So,
That's what I mean, though. They're not going to know. I mean, if you go in there with your license and say this is where
well,
you live.
the poll worker may not know, but it is something that we would catch and we would be dealing with afterwards. These things happen very rarely. They end up going to a district attorney when we have these situations. It's not unusual for people to continue to vote from their old address because their absence from that is temporary. We have students, for example, who still vote at their parents' house. We have people in nursing homes who still vote at their regular residence. Yes?
Yeah, I saw Congresswoman Glenn Moore wrote a letter to you today asking the GAB not to implement the voter ID until after the election.
I saw that she wrote that letter as well. We get a lot of requests not to follow the law. We had requests before photo ID was part of the law to insist that it be there or to let it be voluntary. A lot of the issues about running elections, and this goes to the ballot issue, are partisanly charged issues. And our job is to administer the law as it's presented to us and to take the politics out of it from an administrative standpoint. Wisconsin has a nonpartisan GAB with a nonpartisan staff. Our municipal clerks, if they're elected, are elected on a nonpartisan basis. So we bring a commitment of professionals who are interested in doing their best to serve the voters using the laws that are presented to them. Yes?
The ACLU is asking for a full court review. Will that change your decision at all?
It depends what the court says. We will follow a court order. Just like on Friday, our plans changed because we had a court order that says we may implement this, and the administrative decision was we're going to go forward and implement this. And so if the court stops us, there we go. And chances are that decision could be appealed as well. Our job is to take what's given to us just with the statutes and implement it. Yes?
Speaking of partisan issues you mentioned, do you want to address the ballot change rumors that have been floating around today?
Again, I'm going to make sure we get through all the voter ID issues. I don't consider it to be a high priority issue because ballot design has been, we always get questions on that.
About this election or the future, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Does GAB have any handle either on registered voters or all of Wisconsinites who doesn't have the proper form of identification at this point?
Well, we know from the court case the estimates were that well over 90% of voters had the required identification, and those were, they really are estimates when you look at this. In our system we have about 3.4 million registered voters. Many of them, we have driver's licenses associated with those folks already, so that gives us a good sense. But there's a lot of people, and I think it's not unusual, people in this room or people I talk to, who can't relate to the fact that there are people who do not drive their vehicles, who have had no need to get a passport or to get a state-issued ID. There have been other ways that they operate in society. And I think part of the effort, both with the free ID that's part of the legislation and the administrative changes, but also spending the next 7 weeks is to emphasize to voters this is what needs to be done. We have several states that have an ID requirement, and there's no question that some people have more challenges getting that than others. The court decision showed that, but the final court decision was this isn't enough to set aside the election, or at least it's not enough based on the Seventh Circuit basically said, there's a reasonable probability of success, and so we're going to lift the injunction.
Do you have an estimate on provisional ballots, how many you might get?
I really don't have an estimate on that. Again, it's going to depend on turnout. This will be our first major election with ID. It's also part of what we're training poll workers on and training the voters on to take those steps. Other questions in the room about ID? Yes.
Have you had anyone call in just worried about, if they do have a provisional ballot that they sent in as an absentee that they got, maybe last week, are they worried about the privacy of then sending in their ID?
I haven't heard that question raised. Obviously, anytime you turn over to a municipal clerk that information, or to anyone, there's a concern about that. The truth is our voters turn over a lot of information to people when they do these get out the vote drives.
Yeah, I was talking kind of also about the privacy of their ballot.
Yeah. Well, the ballot isn't going to be the issue because the ID is separated from the ballot. The ballot is sealed in an absentee envelope, and the clerk makes a notation whether the ID was required. If an ID was put inside the ballot, they're going to be checking to see do they have the ID before they take the ballot. When the ballot's separated from the envelope, it's placed with several other ballots, so tracking it back to the voter is difficult or impossible. The only difference we have is in central count absentee places, we do mark the ballots, and that's more to check for double voting. That's not information that's accessible to anyone other than an election official. If there aren't any questions in the room about ID, we'll see if we can take any questions off the line here. Reed, I'm going to count on you. Kevin Kennedy, Kevin Kennedy. It's the Irish version of Smith.
Are there any questions from the people on the phone? This may take a minute for it to get back.
Yeah, Reed, I had a question. This is Jeff with WTAQ Radio in Green Bay. I had a question about the new look for the ballot, if Kevin's going to address that coming up.
I will address that.
Yeah, I mean, is there anybody who has questions about voter ID first?
Okay. How much time do you want to give these?
Give it another second or two.
Okay.
So let's take questions from the room here about the ballots, and then we'll come back to the phone in case we don't answer them.
And let me just start with the fact that, the GAB, by statute, designs the ballots. We work with printers and local election officials primarily because we have several different presentations for the ballot. And it's not unusual that we tweak ballots in advance. One of the issues that we've been looking at since 2000, all election officials, is the impact on ballot design and usability with voters. One of the things I've emphasized with the staff, and we've had a hard time finding the time to do it because we had a few other things on our plate, is making sure we're implementing some of the common sense suggestions we've learned from graphic design experts. Things about how you align names on a ballot, the fact that you don't use all caps, how you separate offices, things like that. And we're trying to implement those. We work with, quite frankly, 1,925 other experts on this, 1,923 county and municipal clerks. More importantly, we work with the ballot printers to make sure that the complexity of the ballot can be formatted in a way to be presented. So it's not unusual that there's a change. It's not unusual that someone has an objection. to this. Sometimes we have people who don't like their names, the way they get formatted because of a combination of capitals within their name, for example. So there's always ballot challenges. So on one level, the fact that someone's raising a question is not unusual. The fact that someone would attribute any partisan motivation to the staff of the GAB is where I would use the term that it's absurd. You know, this is a group of people who dedicate themselves to being fair and impartial, and when they look at ballot design, they're looking at what's best. They're not perfect. They're not experts. I have some quibbles with the way some of the things came out, but you know, this is where we rely on. I don't think the issue that's been presented is anything other than something to gin up a lot of partisan activity on this. That's my basic statement on this. I'm happy to respond to specific questions. I think that addressed the new format question that came in. So, Patrick, you started with a question that I put off.
Well, is there any thought given at all to redesigning or reprinting them? Is that, in a practical sense,
it's not
at all possible? And if it were possible, would you see any reason at all?
The practical question is any thought given to redesigning? There's always thought given to redesigning or making changes, but at some point you have to draw the line. That line was drawn a while back on this. Most of the ballots have been printed. The cost involved in that would be several $100,000, depending on how many get printed, what type of ballot it is, because 90% of our ballots are set up on an optical scan paper ballots, so the printers have to work with timing marks so that the ballots can get counted. That's why most of our efforts in designing these ballots focuses on the printers that the county clerks hire, or the printers that are working with the voting equipment companies on that. So it's not a practical solution to make any changes at this point. And what we're doing is we're playing around with some perception issues, which we have with every election. You take that and you use that for the next time you're focused on the election. And I suppose one of the things is we look for some more input from the people who have their names on the ballot as well. But it's not unusual in an election that there's a focus on ballot design. This is one of the few times it's come up in Wisconsin. It has come up with punch card design in other states. So, the big answer is it's really not practical to make any changes now, and I wouldn't say that it's really necessary to make any changes now.
Just to clarify, you're saying this has nothing to do with the November 2014 elections. This is an idea being bounced around, but it will not impact what Wisconsin voters see this fall.
No, I didn't say that at all. The ballot looks different. We've made some changes. They're not significant differences. There's one concern has to do with should we have put a line between the instructions and the first set of candidates on the ballot underneath the instructions, because you have different instructions for governor than you do for other races. In spring elections, you have different instructions where you have to vote for more than one candidate. As I said, you can quibble over whether that line should have been there, but to suggest that was done for any kind of partisan purpose, or, from what I've read, misquoting the law. The statute set out the ballot order, and the ballot order depends on the results of the prior election. And so the 2012 ballot order started with Republicans, followed by Democrats, followed by, and I don't remember the fourth parties that were on, and that was based on what was the votes in 2010. We look at 2014, we look at the votes that were cast for president. The Democrats go first, the Republicans go second, the Constitution Party, which is in the other ballot name, goes third. They didn't run a candidate for president, I don't think, in 2012, or if they did, it certainly came in behind the Democrats and the Republicans. That's determined by that. There is a provision in the statute that some people are pointing to. It's actually a statute that was originally part of when we had a separate presidential ballot. And if you read it carefully, it deals with the ordering names of presidential candidates, and that would be consistent with the way we lined up the ballots in 2012. Any other questions? Anybody want to get back to voter ID? Well, Thank you very much. I really appreciate the time. I hope you spent a lot of time talking about voter ID in your coverage, that you'll link to our website, to our pages. You see some things behind us. Feel free to contact Reed for any follow-up information on this, and I will do my best, as will our staff, to make ourselves available to the media in the next 49 days to do whatever we can to shed light on the process.
Thank you so much.